Wow, we're already up to paragraph 4. Paragraph 4 has to do with financing. And you can see there's a couple of things in bold print on this particular paragraph. This is going to take a little longer because we want to make sure that you really understand this paragraph, and a couple of things that a lot of agents misunderstand about this paragraph. So first of all, it says not for use with reverse mortgage financing. So you know that you can do a purchase with a refinance, but you would not want to use this provision here. There's a separate reverse mortgage financing form that you would use. Okay, it goes on to say that the portion of the sales price not payable in cash will be paid as followed, and then you check all the appropriate boxes, because you could have a transaction where there's third-party financing involved, where they're actually assuming part of the loan, and maybe the seller is doing some financing also. I would say close to 99% of the time, it's going to be third-party financing. And what do we mean by third-party financing? Well, a third party is somebody that's not a party to the contract. So seller financing would not be third-party financing. What is third-party financing? It's a bank, it's a credit union, it's an insurance company, it's a mortgage company, somebody that is loaning the buyer money, but they are not a party to the contract, okay? So normally on most situations, whatever you put in box 3B, the sum of all the financing would go in box 4A, okay? Now let's read this and make sure that we have a complete good understanding of this paragraph 4A. Third-party financing. One or more third-party mortgage loans and the total amount of, and then you put an amount in there. Now you could have two loans. We used to do this quite often, probably I'd say before 2007, when we had the big lending fiasco, where a buyer would do like maybe an 80% loan as a primary loan, and then maybe a 5% loan as a second loan, and then they would put the rest as a cash. So you don't see that too often anymore, but you could have one where there's multiple third parties or more than one third party. And then it goes on to say, excluding any loan funding fees or mortgage insurance premiums, which is stated up in paragraph 3B. All we're talking about here is how much money is being financed, okay? All right, now number one, I want you to pay close attention to this paragraph if you haven't done these very often, if you're kind of new to writing contracts. So what does 4A1 say? It says property approval. If the property does not satisfy the lender's underwriting requirements for the loan or loans, included but not limited to appraisal, insuranceability, and the lender required repairs, the buyer may terminate this contract by giving notice to the seller prior to closing, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. There's two processes that you go through. You have finance approval, where the lender will check the buyer's financial capabilities. They'll have certain parameters, maybe a certain credit score, a job, proven income, lines of credit, all these things that they're going to verify to make sure that the buyer, in their opinion, is financially set, good, no, or minimum amount of risk as possible. They get finance approval. The second part of the process is loan approval. The property has to meet the lender's underwriting requirements. So you could have a situation where it doesn't appraise high enough, so it wouldn't meet their underwriting requirements. There's a dispute over lender required repairs. Nobody wants to pay for them, so the buyer is going to get out, which we'll talk more about that in a later paragraph. Or you could even have a situation, let's say that you cannot get insurance on that property. Well, it wouldn't meet the lender's underwriting requirements. they're not going to lend you money on a structure and you cannot get any insurance on that structure. So keep in mind, you got the finance approval and you got the loan approval, which is the buyer's financial ability. The second one is the actual property itself. Another situation you could have, let's say this person has great credit. They got a couple of $1 million in the bank. They write up a contract for $100,000 on a house and a piece of property, and the appraiser drives out to the property to do the appraisal. He pulls up and there's a mobile home. And he calls the lender and he says, hey, do you know that you sent me out to do an appraisal on a trailer? And the lender might say, well, we don't loan money, it's on trailers. It doesn't meet our underwriting requirements. We're not going to fund the loan. So keep in mind, you got two things there, finance approval and loan approval. Finance approval is the buyer, loan approval is the actual property. All right. And then the next thing it tells you, number 2, is credit approval, and it says check one box only. So if you've checked 4A, where there is third-party financing involved, then you need to check a box in number 4A2, either A or B. Now let's read what these options are. Remember, check one of these boxes. Don't check them both. Don't leave them blank if you've checked 4A. And if you haven't checked 4A, there's no need to check anything in paragraph 2. So 2A says the contract is subject to buyer being approved for the financing described in the attached third-party addendum for credit approval. So if you check that box, A, you're saying that the buyer needs to make sure they can get finance approval. If they cannot, then they get to terminate the contract and are entitled to have their earnest money returned to them. So you would also check a box in paragraph 22, and then you would also fill out the third-party finance addendum, okay? 4A to B says that the contract is not subject to the buyer being approved for financing, and it does not involve an FHA or VA financing. So if it's a conventional loan or Texas land loan, and the buyer feels real certain that they don't need finance approval, that they're going to get finance approval, then you would check that box 2B. Now, this is not a decision you should make yourself and automatically check box A. You should give the buyer the option. Which one of these boxes do you want to check? Now, if you go in a multiple offer situation and you have box 2B checked, that, hey, we don't need finance approval. We're comfortable. We're not going to use that as an out. Then your offer is going to be a little stronger, all the other things equal. So don't just make that assumption that you need to check box A. Now, if you do check box B on the direction of your buyer, make sure that you've explained to them that if you cannot get finance approval, you're not going to be able to use that as a reason to get your earnest money back. You're going to be expected to perform. Otherwise, you run the risk of being sued for non-performance and suffering financial penalties and also lose your earnest money. But check with your buyer. What are their feeling? Maybe they say, look, Richard, I've got the money in the bank. If I had to pay cash for this house, I'll pay cash for it. If it helps make my offer stronger, sure, we'll check that box, okay? But don't make that assumption and always check box A. I've had a lot of agents, I hear them say that all the time. I always check box A. Well, you don't always do anything. You check with your buyer. You give your buyer advice and opinion, and then whatever they decide is the way you go. Just make sure you explain both sides of that coin before you proceed. All right, we would check box B if the buyer is going to assume the seller's loan. If it's an assumable loan, why would you want to assume a loan at 6% when you can get one for 4%? So you don't see many assumptions going on right now, but there's a possibility that you could. And there's also a promulgated addendum that you would use if in fact they were going to assume the seller's current loan. And then paragraph C, seller's financing, you would put how much they're going to finance, and that would be in that blank line there. And then that's all you have to worry about. You would prepare the seller finance addendum. You don't need to worry about preparing that deed of trust and the liens. The title company would take care of all that stuff for you. So just a quick recap. Third-party financing, you're going to use that most of the time. Remember, there's two parts, the buyer's credit and then the actual property. They both have to pass or they're not going to get a loan. Assuming a loan, you're not going to see that very often. If interest rates start to go back up, you might. And then finally, seller financing, if the seller's going to finance that part or all of the buyer's loan. That's paragraph 4. Appreciate you being here, and we'll see you on the next session.